My name is Nicole Morin Scribner. I am the interviewer and a volunteer with the Biddeford Cultural and Heritage Center. Today is Thursday, November 17th, 2022, and today I have the honor of interviewing Michael Cantara. And is that how you pronounce your name?
I pronounce it Cantara, and that happened when I went away to college because when I went to register for courses, they ask you for your name. And I said, Michael Cantara. And they would say, "Was that with a C or a K?" I said, "With a C." They said, "We don't have that." Because for them, Cantara was Cantara. So I started using all three syllables, and it made it easier.
And do you go by Michael or do people call you Mike?
Both.
Both.
Yeah, doesn't matter.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that you have made yourself available for an interview today. And we are conducting this interview at Michael's home in Biddeford, Maine. So I usually start these interviews at the beginning by asking where and what year were you born?
I was born in Biddeford in June 1953. I'm an adopted child, as is one of my sisters, and my parents adopted me through St. Andre's Home here in Biddeford.
Oh, that's interesting because we've done quite a few interviews with some of the Good Shepherd sisters who worked at St. Andre's Home. So, I'll start with your parents. Tell me a little bit about your parents.
They also were born in Biddeford. My dad was the oldest in his family. He was followed by my Uncle Roger, my Aunt Pauline, and my Uncle Pete. And although they lived at different places in Biddeford, a long time home for his family, his mom and dad, was an apartment on Summer Street, kind of diagonally across the street from the Emory School. My mom was the oldest in her family, born in Biddeford, spent her early childhood through maybe her early teens, probably through 6th or 7th grade, when her parents divorced. She spent some time in Yarmouth where there was some family, some time in Portland, but came back and lived with her aunt Irene Boisvert, who was married to Philip Boisvert, who ran Phil's Cleaner on Water Street. So our roots in Biddeford run deep.
So, do you know how on either side? Do you know how they came to Biddeford in the first place? How many generations?
On my father's side, Ray Pepin, who passed away several years ago, but Ray was an active member of the Biddeford Genealogy Society. Did my father's side genealogy, and the first Cantara, Benjamin Cantara, came from France to Montreal sometimes in the 17th century. I can't remember the exact date, but I think Quebec was founded in 1604, 1607, so maybe 1641, 1651. Originally from southwestern France. It's thought that Cantara might be a Basque name, and of course back then the border between Spain and France was a little fluid. The Basques were also known for being whale hunters, so he might have been a fisherman. I don't know, but that genealogy traces on my father's side the family coming, say, mid to late 17th century.
And then, in terms of making the change from Canada to Biddeford,
my grandfather, my father's father, was born in Quebec. And came over in the early 1900s. My grandmother, his wife, my father's mom, was born in Biddeford, but I have some documents that suggest she wasn't a citizen. I don't know how that is, because I thought if you were born in the States, you're an American no matter what. But she was born in Biddeford. But I have just vague memories of my grandfather. But my grandmother lived until 1980, 1981. But she hardly spoke any English.
Hmm. So, what language did you speak when you were growing up?
At the house and in the neighborhood, it was French. We were brought up on Granite Street Extension, which was not very populated back then. If you wanted to see where the people were, you'd had to go to St. Joseph Cemetery. But French, of course, and when I went to kindergarten at St. Andrews Parish, instruction was in French and English, and instruction was in French and English right through fifth grade, I think. Now, English started being spoken at the house probably after I was 5 years old with the introduction of television. Because when I was a little kid, we didn't have a TV at the house. We used to, on Sunday afternoons, go to my Aunt Irene, who lived in Saco, in what is now the old Carryman's Pub. That was her house with Mr. Boisvert. And spend the afternoon there, and we had supper there, and we stayed long enough to see the Ed Sullivan Show on their TV. But we didn't have a TV at home.
Do you remember that being a challenge in terms of the two languages?
No, it just the way life was. If I wanted to speak to my grandmother, especially my grandmother Cantara, you had to speak to her in French. When we were at Aunt Irene's house, everyone was speaking French. When you went to church, the Mass back then was in Latin, but certainly the sermon and the gospel and many prayers were in French. It just seemed normal.
And the neighborhood that you grew up, was that primarily French as well?
Yes, not as I said, not heavily populated. It was very rural as a kid, but yeah. On one side of my parents' house, Mr. and Mrs. Dutrimble lived there. They didn't speak French, however. But next to the other neighbors, we had Goulet, we had Deschênes, we had Levines, we had Lebrec. Even the D's, Kathy D, maybe, or her sister Linda. But her mom was a Luder. She spoke French. Up the street, the Florent family was there. They spoke French. So it wasn't the little Canada type neighborhood, but it was French speaking.
Now, was there any connection with the Quebec relatives? Did you still have relatives in Quebec?
The answer is yes, but my family chose not to encourage those contacts. I can't tell you why. I know my Aunt Corinne, who's my paternal grandmother's younger sister, maintained a relationship with relatives in Quebec. On my mother's side of the family, some of her relatives maintained connections. So we would hear of or occasionally see them while we were visiting the Biddeford area relatives, or relatives even in Yarmouth. But my parents' family, my parents' close-knit family, didn't maintain a contact. Did we go to Quebec? Yes. We did. One vacation was got in my parents' Rambler, and we drove through upstate New York, saw Niagara Falls, crossed the border, took the Trans-Canada Highway, went to Cap de la Madeleine, then we went Montreal, Cap de la Madeleine, then Quebec City, and of course a visit to the Basilica Saint Anne de Beaupré. And I remember being fascinated as a kid with old Quebec City because it was you had a sense of history, but there was a sense of grandeur that the cities, as I knew them, I mean, the big deal city for if in my childhood, we went to Porteous, Mitchell, and Brown on Congress Street in Portland. Um, so it was, we were aware and I think appreciated that we had roots in Quebec and that we spoke French, but we had no close contact.
How old were you about when you made that trip? Do you recall?
I'm going to say between 10 and 12 years old, or 8 or 12 years old, in that range. I can't. My little sister, the youngest, was with us, but she was just a toddler. Then my sister Janine, then myself. So between 10 12 years old.
Now, other than visiting your aunt in Saco on Sundays, are there any other traditions that you can recall?
Oh, well, if we weren't visiting, Mom would always do a big Sunday dinner slash lunch, early afternoon meal, roast beef, roast pork, ham, chicken, vegetables, and relatives might be invited, like the grandmothers, aunt and uncle, and so the communal family Sunday meal was part of our routine, and it always smelled good and tasted good.
Any special holiday traditions?
In our family, the holiday, Christmas and New Year's were divided. Christmas, my father and my mom hosted the entire family on both sides. Big, big spread. It wasn't le réveillon. It wasn't after the midnight mass, although we did go to midnight mass at the time. But it was usually on a Sunday, big Christmas buffet of pork pies and salads and aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, great aunts came. And New Year's Day was at my Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Roger's home in Saco. And similar, but in honor of New Year's. What I do remember about the New Year's ceremony at my aunt and uncle's is that my aunt, parents, the people who had the apartment on the ground floor on Elm Street we talked about earlier, they had maintained that old Quebec tradition of having the father of the family bless the kids. The Cantara family didn't do that, but my aunt, whose maiden name was Crotto, I remember clearly, they knelt in the kitchen and her father blessed all the adult kids. And that left a memory in my brain.
Now, with not much TV and what have you, and some of the things that we take for granted nowadays, do you remember like what you kids did for fun or to pass the time as a family?
Both my parents worked. My dad worked started with the Saco Lowell shops, then moved to Saco at Marymount, and now General Dynamics, I think. And he worked there a little bit before entering World War II, but certainly his adult life after the Second World War till retirement was at Marymount. Mom worked as a waitress or in retail, in stores, or cashier at Ray's Market, corner of West and Granite. It was right down the street from where we lived. And I'm sorry, your original question?
What did you do for fun or pastimes?
Well, in the summer, we would head to the water. We did not have a camp, but my maternal grandmother and her friend, we called him Uncle Henry, had a camp on Sebago Lake, so we often went there. We often went to William State Park in New Hampshire. It wasn't too far of a ride, but freshwater lake, nice beach, lifeguards. or we'd go to Ferry Beach, or to Saco, Bayview in Saco, um, or Fortune's Rock. Um, we would also go to what's the name of Barker's Pond. There was a public beach you had to pay, but Barker's Pond and Deer Pond. Um, Again, it's pine trees, picnic tables. And, my mother would pack a lunch. It might be egg salad sandwiches and a bag of chips, and it was one of the rare occasions we were permitted to have soda, tonic. So it was during the warm weather, somewhere by the water, and during the school year and winter, we'd go skating on Wilcox Pond or at St. Louis skating rink. Sometimes at Westbrook, but we were closer to St. Louis rink in proximity. And Wilcox Pond, we went there often at St. Joseph Cemetery. Someone kept it up. Maybe people who live closer. I was too young to participate in that. But skating, and especially with the racer blades, was a big deal as a kid. And in the spring, early summer, even if we were still in school, baseball, organized in the neighborhood. Didn't have enough for a full team, but didn't matter.
Now, you went to St. Andre's School first.
Yeah, that was our parish in St. Andre's School for kindergarten through 8th grade. And there we were taught by, for the nuns, it was the Sisters of the Presentation of Mary. And for the brothers, because they were co-ed classes up until 6th grade, and then 6th, 7th, 8th, junior high, if you will, although I don't think we use that term. The boys were segregated, and we had, and as a boy, had the Brothers of Sacred Heart. Then went to St. Louis.
Now, what do you remember about school at St. Andre's? Anything in particular stand out in terms of things that you either really enjoyed or people may not be aware of?
I enjoyed school. I thought I had good teachers, and that started in kindergarten with the kindergarten teacher for the boys. Boys and girls were separated. It was Mademoiselle Simon. I think her last name was Morissette, but of course as a kid we didn't know that. She was very good. I remember thinking the school was huge. I remember being impressed by my father. Apparently the school, which are now apartments, used to be elsewhere on that property, and my father remembered as a kid / student at St. Andre's, because he went there too, living on Summer Street, that would have been their parish, helping to tear down the walls of the old school to build the new one. So it impressed me that my dad had a hand in that. I remember how big the school was. Remember the exercises, the air raid exercises we participated in case of nuclear attack. Crouching down underneath those big wooden and cast iron desks. I remember, and I think I may have been in kindergarten, remember I was a bus kid, so I was one of the last of the kids to leave kindergarten because the bus came, but a lot of kids lived in the neighborhood, and a good friend of mine, and I haven't saw him recently on downtown, but Mike Lasante, his father owned Joe's Donut Shop on Alfred Street. And remember walking Mike to the lot of land where St. Andrew's Church, the rectory, the convent, the school are. We used to walk kids to different corners of that, and the sister or Mademoiselle Simon would be with us to make sure they crossed safely. And remember Mike crossing the sidewalk and he's continuing down Bacon Street. And I yelled out, "Bye, Mike." And the nun, it was a sister, turned around and says, "Non, c'est au revoir, Monsieur la Santé." Okay. But it was, that stuck with me because I think they were committed making sure we kept the French language in that culture.
Now, what role did the church play in your family traditions and with school?
Well, with the family, both my parents were practicing Catholics. Their faith was important to them. And so not only did they send their children to parochial school, never missed Sunday Mass. If we went up to my maternal grandmother's camp on Sebago Lake, we would go to Mass at their summer chapel. Always went to church, to Mass on the days of holy obligation. And all the rituals in addition to the feast days, like blessing of the throat, Ash Wednesday, going to confession. Of course, going to confession was really coming out of the school instead of the family, because you're in parochial school, you're literally a 3-minute walk from the classroom to church, so that we didn't see the priests very often at St. Andre's. I mean, once in a while. But, you were surrounded by nuns, initially for the first few years, in their traditional habits, long glass dress and covered head. But even after that, they were easily recognizable in their more modern habits. And again, it was just normal.
Were you an altar boy?
No, I could not be an altar boy because I lived too far away. And back when I was a child, there were several masses said, well, so at least a few masses said every day in addition to Sunday. And the first mass began at 6 a.m. People going to work. And I lived too far away to walk to be an altar boy for 6 a.m. or even something at 7 or 8. We only had one car, as most families did. So I wasn't an altar boy.
Now, because St. Andre's, when it's time to move on to the high school, people have a choice. They can either go to St. Louis or they can go to Biddeford.
I don't remember having that discussion with my parents or anyone else. I think it was just assumed on my part, because I honestly have no memory of decision making, that I'd go to St. Louis. It just seemed to be the way things would be.
And what was your experience at St. Louis like?
Again, a good experience. Good Shepherd Sisters and the Brothers Christian Instruction. Now, going into high school, 1967, 1966, we had some lay teachers, Mr. and Mrs. Daigle, for example, Mr. Morrell, Mr. LaPointe, but the nuns and brothers were, I thought they were good teachers, and St. Louis became a home away from home. I remember forming good friendships there, and we'd hang out at the school building after hours, and the nuns or brothers would have to chase us out. They said, "You have to go home. You can't just stay here."
What kinds of activities did you get involved with? Some of the activities at high school?
I was in the band, so I knew Mr. Drapo. And I just wanted to be part of the band. I wasn't musical, as Mr. Drapo, if you were still alive, would tell you. And all that was left to join the band was the sousaphone, the marching tuba. And back then they weren't out of plastic; they were out of brass. And so I was given I think it was a 65-pound brass instrument for marching parade purposes.
So did you get to do like the trip to New York?
Yes, St. Patrick's Day. Yes, I remember fundraising for that. And a blizzard was hitting Biddeford. We were going door to door. Well, I can't. Were we selling bread? Were we selling Sacred Heart calendars? Of course, did that. Sold bread and sold Sacred Heart calendars door to door when I was at St. Andre's. I remember pulling a wagon with the loaves of bread that John Paquette had baked, and just if it wasn't too cold, it smelled wonderful. But yeah, went to the St. Patrick's Day parade. That was fun, and of course, St. Louis's band was hired out by local small communities like Limerick for things like Memorial Day parades. We might do the big one in Biddeford, Saco in the morning, but early afternoon go to Limerick or other small towns in our woolen uniforms.
Now, when you went to do the parade, the St. Patrick's Day parade in New York City, was that your first time in New York City or going to a big city?
I think it was my second time. My godmother, who has passed away, lived with her husband and two kids in Hartford, Connecticut. And I was invited one summer to spend a few days with her on Sisson Avenue in Hartford in their big apartment. They eventually, I think, got to own the apartment building. But so one day, may have been a Sunday, piled in their car, my godmother, her husband, and their two little kids. They were a little younger than I was, and drove into New York City. It was fascinating. Went to Rockefeller Square, but it was just sort of a drive through, seeing the highlights, then motored back up to Hartford. I do remember with the St. Patrick's Day parade, we were there long enough. We got to see the UN building, which was fascinating.
So, having been at St. Louis, do you remember where you were or how you found out about the closure?
Certainly remember the closure. I remember the anguish and disappointment and downright anger, I think, in some people, and myself included, that it caused. How did I find out, or where was I when I found out? I honestly don't remember. I don't. Did I hear it at school? Did I hear it from my parents? Did I hear it? Could have been from church. I don't remember.
Mm-hmm. And so then, because you would have been
In my junior year.
and so then you had to do what was that like, facing having to be your final year in high school going to Biddeford?
Well, I think I and my fellow students, certainly the people I considered friends at the time, that you'd hang out with or talk to, I think it was an emotional upset. And a couple of minutes ago I said, we had kind of made the school our home. And in a way, we were losing our home. Yes, of course, we had a multi-generational rivalry with Biddeford High School. But, I think by the time I was a junior in high school, a lot of families had kids, cousins, even siblings, at Biddeford as well as St. Louis. That line may not have been as impenetrable as it might have been 20 years earlier. But the loss of our home, the sense of identity, I think we identified as St. Louis high school kids. I think that made it difficult. Remember speaking, there was a public forum at St. Joseph's Hall explaining why the school was being closed. I remember speaking, and I probably was not very happy when I did that.
And but you found a way to get through your senior year.
Oh yes, I mean, I got elected school president for the student council, um, and so and I didn't realize or appreciate it at the time, unfortunately. But as years went by after high school, my hat is off to the hard work that faculty and administrative staff, and frankly, probably the janitorial staff and the bus drivers did in making it work. Was it easy? I'm sure it wasn't. Did everyone like it? I know not everyone did. My sister was on the second session, so she hated getting out of school when it was dark. Um, but the adults who were helping with that transition really did a fantastic job, I think. It was could not have been easy for them, and I'm sure there were times where they might have thought, speculation on my part, they were just making it up as they were going along just to make things work.
Now, you alluded to the second session, so tell me a little bit more about that and how that impacted you.
In order to accommodate the influx of students into Biddeford High School from St. Louis, and there was not enough classroom space, uh, the school administrators designed two sessions, morning sessions for seniors and juniors, which started earlier and ended, I think, around noontime. So, from my perspective, it gave me a whole afternoon to do what I wanted to do. I mean, usually just went home, but it was kind of nice. For someone like my sister, who was a sophomore, and sophomore and juniors at the second session, your school day started at about noon, but you didn't get out till 4:30, 5 o'clock. And this time of year, we're talking in November, mid-November, it was dark. And it disrupted sports schedule and activity schedule. I'm sure, and I don't remember thinking about this at the time, but it might have been difficult on parent schedules. Making sure you could drop off or pick up your child, make sure your child's getting home and walking home in the dark. Um, I think as a teenager, many of us had were not mature enough and felt safe enough not to think about the problems. But I'm sure our parents and teachers did.
Did you have any jobs when you were in high school?
I did. My sophomore year, I was a stock boy at the S&H Green Stamps Redemption Center next to W.T. Grant. So I would leave St. Louis, walk down Graham Street, and go to the S&H Green Stamp store, and it was run. The manager was Mrs. Karen, who had two daughters at St. Louis, older than I was, and Mrs. Cody was her assistant. But I would, when I wasn't stocking the shelves in the back, I was dusting the merchandise in the front.
So I'm guessing that there are probably a lot of people who are going to listen to this interview who have no clue what you're talking about when you say the S&H green stamps. Can you just give us the Reader's Digest version of that?
Yeah, it's a variation of what, for example, today in 2022, if you shop at Hannaford's, you'll be asked at the cashier, do you have a rewards card with us? Or some credit cards where you get points or even money back for using the card. S&H green stamps were literal stamps perforated with the logo of the company, green and white in color, sticky. You had to either use your tongue or get a sponge or wet your fingers, and you were given books, blank books, and you would get stamps from participating merchants. And there was a formula, and I don't know the formula, but you would get so many stamps for so many dollars worth of purchase. You would take those stamps and stick them in the book, and there came a catalog, and the prices of the items in the catalog, sort of gift type things, household things, ceramic bowls, glassware,
Toaster.
yeah, things that you would put in the kitchen or on the living room, or as my father might call them, dust collectors. Um, and instead, you couldn't buy them with money or a check. You bought them with books, and a toaster might be worth, just by way of example, 5 books. So once you got 5 books that were completed, and you had to stick the stamps on both sides of the page. So when you brought them to the store, yeah, the books were kind of crinkly because they had been wet, they had been moistened, and you purchased your item with those books, and it worked for many years. And there was another set of stamps, gold stamps, and those were yellowish gold in color. But I worked at the Green and S&H Green Stamp store.
Hmm.
I also worked during the summer in Old Orchard at the Plusnik grocery store. Everyone called them Jaime's grocery store on East Grand Avenue in Old Orchard Beach. And I and a couple of classmates were hired because we were bilingual. And although it was a kosher grocery store and the synagogue was nearby in Old Orchard, obviously Old Orchard Beach, particularly in the 70s, attracted a lot of French-Canadian, Quebec tourists, and they would come shop, and the Plusniks wanted stock boys and cashiers who could communicate with the customers.
So you kept your French. You were still
Oh,
actively bilingual.
yes. With certain relatives, that was still going on, and I took French courses even after the teaching in French and English through 5th grade at St. Andre's. 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, we still had French class. French class was taught as though you already knew French. Most of us did, not everyone did, so I think they must have found it hard. At St. Louis, I took French courses my freshman, sophomore, and junior year. I would have taken it my senior year at Biddeford, but the class conflicted with a English literature course that I wanted, so I dropped French in my senior year.
So I'm going to take a slightly divergent road because I'm kind of curious about this. When did your parents share with you that you were adopted?
I appreciate the question. They always told me and my sister, the youngest sister that I have was born in the old-fashioned way. They told us right up front. We grew up knowing that we were adopted. Remember one of the childhood books that they had was, I wish, I hope one of my elder sister has it, but it was entitled something like Why You Were Chosen, or You Were Chosen, something like that. May not be remembering exactly, but I remember a book, and it was somehow it fell into normal conversation, and I think what they tried to do, because some kids teased me for being adopted, but that did not come as a shock or a surprise, because I knew, from my perspective, was, yeah, what's the big deal? I remember going with my mom, and I'm sure my sister Janine was with us, going to St. Andre's Home, which is now St. Andre's Healthcare. Used to have a summer bazaar to fundraise for St. Andre's Home. I remember going there with my mom, and there were tables of food and games to play. It was just part of the family narrative.
And so, what do you recall how they had explained it to you?
Something along the lines of, your mother was not able to take care of you. She loved you very much. She wanted to make sure you got a good home, and that's why we adopted you. Something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
But it started when I was so young that it was just a fact.
Now, I had heard, and it may have changed through the years, from the St. Andre's, when I interviewed people who are running St. Andre's, that there was a combination of they did outreach trying to find families, and obviously there was the opposite of where there were couples who were actively looking for children. Did they by any chance share with you that dynamic?
It's my understanding that my parents sought St. Andrew's Home for adoption, and the reason why is that when my parents got married after World War II, 1947, 46, 47, but the war was over. After they got married, they wanted children. My mother went through 7 miscarriages, everywhere from early on to stillborn, and was advised that she could not have children again and that she should avoid pregnancy. So at that point, they decided to adopt.
So you mentioned, did your father serve in World War II?
Yes, he did. He enlisted, obviously after Pearl Harbor. He enlisted. He was in the Army, and the photo of his platoon is right over your shoulder, where your coat is. That's in the camp in Massachusetts. He was a soldier. He did the North African theater, the Italian theater, but because he was bilingual, and this happened to many bilingual military at the time men, he was recruited by the OSS, which was the precursor of the CIA, to train to assist the Allied invasion on D-Day. And he's not the only one to whom this happened, and Polish Americans and German Americans and other languages had similar experiences, I'm told. But he was recruited because he could speak French and was trained how to parachute, and was parachuted into Normandy 30 days before D-Day in civilian clothing, was met by some form of French resistance operatives, and was in hiding, living amongst Frenchmen, Normans, until D-Day. And the danger with that, war is of course inherently dangerous, but the danger with that is that as a civilian enemy of the Third Reich, had he been discovered, the rules and regulations of war, the Geneva Convention, would not have applied. He could have been killed summarily on the spot because he would have been declared a spy. So he rarely talked about the war. He told a story about his admiration for the city of Algiers. Told me about how in Italy there was an abundance of fresh food, but they were told not to eat the fruits and vegetables because of the way those crops were fertilized. And there was two stories that he told about Normandy. One was he was with some French men one night, and they were passing around a bottle of Calvados. Calvados is an amber colored alcohol distilled from apples, and it's sort of a regional specialty, alcoholic specialty for Normandy, and it's the only distilled fruit that keeps a bit of the odor and taste of the apple, not sweet, but that pungent, if you ever walked into an orchard in the fall, the fallen apples are on the ground, that kind of musky smell. And he said, we went around, we passed the bottle, and then it was time to leave. Everyone got up except me because my legs weren't working anymore. And the other memory he shared was, I did my junior abroad in Normandy, and went back a few years later and visited St. Mary Glees. St. Mary Glees, where, if you're familiar with the Longest Day movie, uh, where the American soldier gets hung up on the belfry of the church, with that, visited that village. And I told my father when I returned that we had gone there. I had told him earlier of being on the D-Day beaches, but went to St. Mary Glees, and described the square and the church. And he said, "Yeah, those trees. A lot of our boys, as he would call them, got hung up as they parachuted in, and they were caught in either the trees or the electrical lines. And contrary to the Geneva Convention, the Germans were killing them summarily as they were entangled. They should have been made prisoners." He said, "And I couldn't do a thing about it." And that was all he said. But I took from that, because he was still dressed as a civilian, he could not reveal himself. And you could tell it weighed heavily on him. After Normandy, he was part of that group of soldiers that was sent to Belgium for the Battle of the Bulge. And at the Battle of the Bulge, which was a wintertime battle, his feet got wet and froze. And so he was sent back to the United States for treatment. And the doctors came very close to amputating his feet. And he begged them not to do that. And his feet eventually healed, but they were always very tender. And he endured quite a bit of discomfort, if not outright pain. Never complained. Working at Marymount factory, he never complained. But in work shoes, work boots, cement floor, on feet, 8, 10, 12 hours a day. And I remember he'd come home and he would change, but he would not put his stockings on, because he would fill a basin of hot water and just soak his feet to give him relief. Again, never uttered any discomfort or complaint, but you could tell just by looking at his face, it was not easy.
Wow. So, turning the clock back a little bit to high school's over, how did you decide what to do next?
I decided, really thanks to teachers and guidance counselors. Of course, you apply for college in your senior year, at least you did back then. And if I'm talking too much, let me know. And I think I know my parents encouraged college, but I can't say that they pushed college. My father hadn't graduated from high school. He went off to war. He got his GED later, and I remember him studying it at the kitchen table to get his GED. My mother went through 8th grade, graduated from St. Mary's School. And she went to St. Mary's instead of St. Joseph's because, though she was bilingual, her time in Portland and Yarmouth, when she was in Portland, she went to Cathedral School, and in Yarmouth, public school. So her writing, her reading was stronger in English. But teachers, Mr. Daigle, who's also a guidance counselor, and Mr. Panansky at Biddeford, encouraged me to look at high school, and somehow an appointment was made, or I was told to make an appointment with Mr. Panansky, and he suggested I apply to 3 colleges, UMO, Colby, and another one I forget, and I got accepted by Colby.
And what was your experience there like?
I liked it, but initially interesting. And I say that because here I am in Waterville, Maine. I had been to the Colby campus a couple of years earlier because that's where the statewide science fair was held. Thought it looked nice. It's probably why I applied. It looked nice. It wasn't a deeply researched effort on my part, but with the push from Mr. Panansky. And there were several kids in my class who ended up going to Colby that year. um, Billy Minuti, God rest his soul, Ron Willett, Christine Robert, um, Mike Perro. I'm forgetting people, but there were a few of us um, who went, who applied and went to Colby. Ron Willett finished, Billy Minuti finished, I finished, Mike did not. But anyhow, so here I am on the campus, and I was a good boy in high school, but I figured here I am in college. I'm going to make friends with the people, my guys in my dorm, because it was segregated by gender, and asked, "You want to go downtown and get a drink?" And they said, "Sure, where'd you go?" Someone had told me about a Chez, they called it Chez Paris. Of course, it's Chez Paris. And I said, "I've heard about this place called Chez Paris." And these guys, I think probably from Massachusetts, being from Maine at Colby was a rare animal. And they said, "Oh, we can't go there." I said, "Why?" He says, "That's in the French section." I'm thinking, yeah, so what? And I remember sitting down at the cafeteria for a meal. Everyone's talking, people getting to know each other, and people are talking about what they did summer going into the first semester of freshman year. This one worked for a non-profit as an intern. This one went to Amsterdam in the Netherlands and worked for some international company. This one traveled in Europe. This one backpacked in the Rocky Mountains. And they come to me and said, "So what did you do?" I said, "I salvaged shock absorbers at Marymount in Saco." And they looked at me and said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, if a shock absorber was defective, I would insert it in the machine, it would pull it apart, and it was my job to salvage all the parts so that the good ones could be reused again." And it just, the people at that table weren't working. They didn't have to work. And that was kind of different for me. So that the experience and wealth gap was the first time I felt that. No one was making me feel bad or less because of it, but it was just like, oh, there are different ways of growing up, aren't they?
So it was from Colby then that heard you say you did a junior year abroad?
Yes, at the time, I think it may still be the case, but at the time, Colby, either on its own, and the French program was on its own, or through affiliated colleges, offered a junior abroad, either one semester or an academic year, and you would pay no more for that than it would to stay on campus. For me, that was a gift, that was a bonus, because between borrowing money, working summers, putting my money aside because I could come home and stay at my parents for free, that was a good deal financially. And so I went to Colby thinking I'd be pre-med and become a doctor, because I so admired the pediatrician I had as a kid, Dr. Ross. But organic chemistry and I did not see eye to eye. In fact, I really crashed and burned in organic chemistry. So I said, I'm going to be a French major, and I'll be a French teacher. So I enrolled in their junior abroad, which was at the University of Caen, Caen, in Normandy, and it was a wonderful experience.
Now, how did you find it to be very different than Biddeford, or?
Caen was a bigger city, still is, and a more modern city. Caen has deep, dating back to Roman times roots, and certainly was a big city in the Middle Ages and had extensive Middle Age architecture in addition to Gothic cathedral and Gothic churches, monasteries. Most of that got wiped out during World War II, which I learned on the day I transitioned from a dormitory, because we were brought to campus early, and they had limited dormitory space. At the time, French universities usually didn't have many dormitory rooms. Kids lived nearby. Uh, but the taxi guy, the cab driver who got me from the dormitory to the apartment I found in town, said, "Vous savez, you know, it's you people who bombed us." And he was telling me a fact. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry. He explained, and it was subsequently confirmed. Caen was the headquarters of the German army for that area of the Atlantic in Normandy. And we tried like heck to get the headquarters through bombing, through British, Canadian, and American bombing. Nearly wiped out the whole city, but never got the headquarters. And so the beautiful old architecture that existed before World War II disappeared, and the Caen that I knew and still exists is largely concrete slabs as buildings, 4 or 5 story tall. They've done wonderful things with the streets, but it's very modern, very plain because of the war.
And so you went to school there for your junior year?
Yeah, an academic year, and was thrilled to hear some people, including some young people, use words that that we would recognize here in Biddeford. I remember watching a local cable TV show. They're interviewing a young, in his 20s, young Norman farmer, talking about dry conditions, and agriculture was not too far from the city at the time. And this young farmer was saying something about il faut qu'il mouille, and modern French would say il faut qu'il pleut, but il faut qu'il mouille. And I said, I know that word. That's what we say at home. Mouille, mouiller. And there were other examples of words that I can't think of off the top, but I said, okay, you know, we're not so separated after all. So yeah, that was neat.
So what happened after, so that was your junior year abroad, then you came back?
Finished my undergraduate studies at Colby. In my second semester at Colby, I learned I was the recipient of a Fulbright teaching fellowship, and that had me, and I had been accepted to Middlebury College in their master's program in French literature. Fortunately, Middlebury was gracious enough to keep my spot open at Middlebury, so I could take advantage of the Fulbright, and that brought me back to Normandy in a town right outside of Rouen, the upper part of Normandy, a little town called Sotteville-les-Rouen. It's as close to Rouen as Saco is to Biddeford, and literally there's the Seine River separating the two, just like we have the Saco. And it was a co-ed vocational high school. I was given minimum wage salary every month. I was given a free room in the dormitory, 2 meals, lunch and dinner, at the school cafeteria, and got to spend an academic year in Normandy and France again. Bought my first brand new bicycle. I had bicycles as a kid, but they were always secondhand, so I bought my first new bicycle and biked all over Normandy on weekends, and just had a blast.
So was it difficult to come back?
To Maine? No. Actually, that the year of the Fulbright, I decided to. I saved my money and I bought a plane ticket. Came home for Christmas. which I did not do my junior year abroad because I didn't have the money. And I was glad I did because my father's youngest brother, my uncle, had cancer. I got to say goodbye before he passed on. But no, it wasn't. I mean, I would. It wasn't hard because I knew I was coming back. As the Middlebury program, I spent all summer. They cram. You go to classes 5 days a week for 3.5 months. May, June, July, 2 or 3 weeks in August. So you get a full semester's worth of instruction at Middlebury, in Middlebury, Vermont, before you go to Paris, and the rest of the academic year is through the University of Paris, the Institute of Political Science, and so I had a full academic year in Paris, so I knew I was going back. So it was I was really lucky.
So you spent some time in Normandy. You actually spent close to a year in Paris, you said, and again, you must have had some choices, but you made a choice to come back here?
Well, I did. Originally, after the program through Middlebury, which was interesting because through a good friend of mine, who I met at Colby, a French woman, a Parisian, I landed a free room because her Hebrew teacher wanted her children to know English. Her children and my French teacher and her husband worked for IBM, and they spent a full year, maybe two, in outside of New York City while he worked for IBM. Their two youngest ones, their two daughters, spoke a flawless American English, but they wanted their girls to continue. So the deal was, we'll give you a room, and in order to earn your keep, you'll speak English to our daughters. You will house clean the house and take care of the yard. For someone who didn't have two nickels to rub together, that was perfect. And they were Orthodox Jews. Yes, Orthodox. Conservative Jews. I'm sorry. And they kept kosher, and I was taught how to keep a kosher kitchen because on Wednesdays, the two daughters got out of school at noon. Wednesday was a half day of school for them, and the older of the two girls had music lessons, so she didn't come home right away, but little Sarah did. And I would make her lunch, but I had to know how to cook kosher, and I was taught and did it, which was interesting to me.
Talk about a number of coincidences.
Exactly. Good luck, and someone was looking out for me. And after that, it was occurring to me that, clear to me that I had decided if I teach French, I want to teach on the college level. Unlikely that I'd find something in Maine without waiting someplace else several years. And I wanted to come back to Maine, and I wanted to come back close to Biddeford. So I got accepted in the PhD program in French at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. But I took the LSATs, the law, national law exam, which I had taken in Paris at the American Cultural Center, but I had the flu the day I took it. Frankly, I didn't do that well, so I retook it at Michigan, did well enough, submitted my application to the University of Maine, and got accepted. And so that brought me back to Maine, and while I was at law school in Portland, met a good friend who had roots from down East Maine, but he and his wife had been living in southern Maine, and we decided we'd open a law firm together. We opened a law office on Crescent Street.
Well, that's an interesting segue because whenever I look at your background and then I know what your career developed into, and we certainly will get to that, I kept thinking, okay, here's someone who has done all of these studies in French And he's an attorney, so when did you jump off that cliff?
I jumped off that cliff primarily to be back in Maine. I cannot say that growing up I thought of becoming a lawyer. No, growing up I thought, like a lot of Catholics, I thought, oh, maybe I'll become a priest. Oh, well, that doesn't have all the benefits I want. So, well, maybe I'll be a teacher. And 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 frankly, I thought maybe I'll go to school, but when I graduate, I'll go work at Marymount. My parents did well. My father did well there. I had other relatives that lived there. Good pay, good benefits. Maybe I'll do that. But then I went, yeah, I'll become a teacher. But as my studies in French deepened, I said, I'd like to teach on the college level. There was just no way I'd be doing that. So I said, and a friend of mine, and with whom I still remain friends, said he had gone directly, same age as me, had gone directly from high school to college, Deering High to college, from college to law school in Portland. He said, why don't you apply to law school? You can use a law degree in so many ways, and you'll be back in Maine. So I took his advice. So that's how I jumped off the cliff. It wasn't a well thought out, ever since I was 10 I wanted to do this. It was sort of opportunistic.
So I would imagine that the day-to-day life of an attorney is very different than a teacher.
It's less predictable because I did some student teaching as well as teaching at the University of Michigan to earn a stipend. My friend Jim Boone, who's since passed away, and I had a small general practice law firm here in Biddeford, as there were many of them. I mean, Herschel Lerman, Tuffy Fatanities, across the river, Eddie Caron and Ron Caron, Mr. Harvey. There were just a lot of solo practice. Lloyd LaFountain, and years ago before that, Ted Garland. But a small general practice. I mean, we did criminal defense work, we did some divorces, we did some collection work, we did some contracts, some wills and trust. It was a little bit of everything. I think it'd be hard. It's been hard to do that in recent decades, but at the time, you still could dabble, still be proficient enough to serve your client well. And one of the nice things, I think it still exists, but certainly one of the nice things of hanging our shingles here in Biddeford, the existing lawyers in Biddeford and Saco, and elsewhere, but Biddeford and Saco, were very welcoming. Said, you need help with this? Just give me a call. If you have this kind of case, I've got forms that might help you on that. Well, I'll make you some photocopies, just let me know. Very supportive, very helpful. But unlike a teacher who might change classrooms in a building, or even buildings if it's a campus, being a lawyer in York County meant working in Biddeford District Court, Springvale District Court, Superior Court in Alfred, and on occasion, and at the time would have been in Kittery, now York District Court. So, and of course, proximity to Portland meant you might be getting up to Portland once in a while. And I remember a couple of times going up to Lewiston, because clientele in Biddeford might have some relations to people in Lewiston.
What did you find especially challenging of doing that kind of work?
Think the case either in divorce or post-divorce cases, or in child protective cases, or in juvenile cases. Cases dealing with children, whether it's an accusation against a parent for neglecting or abusing a child, or a child accused of some wrongdoing, stealing, say, shoplifting, or children being abused, and either representing someone who's accused of abusing that child or being a guardian ad litem for that child. Those were challenging. Um, I cannot say that there was a whole lot in law school that had prepared me for the emotional or psychological side of that. Yeah, those types of cases, and not confined only to those, but those types of cases, certainly got exposed to a lot of sad stories.
What did you find rewarding in that line of work?
Once in a while you had people who might be in a better place because of your help. But generally it was you didn't always, you working as a lawyer, and I found later as a judge, you come up with a solution for a problem. Sometimes the problem pleases the client, but sometimes it's just a solution. It doesn't address the root causes of the problem. If you were thanked by a client, that was, wonderful. If your client called you again, or referred their cousin or their neighbor, that was satisfying. And certainly as a lawyer, if you heard from either another lawyer or a judge, good work, that was satisfying.
Now, at some point, maybe it was before this, you also started to play a more active role in like public service.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me about that journey.
Well, I ran for the House of Representatives while I was a lawyer. In the primary, my opponent was Lucian Babe Dutrumbull. And I went door to door looking for, asking people for their vote. Remember knocking at one door on State Street, and who answers, and it was nice, must have been spring because it was for the primary. Who opens the screen door but a young man who I had seen in court earlier that day, and he was accused of not paying off a debt to my client, so this was in small claim. And he said, "I told you this morning I was going to be paying you next month." And, "I'm sorry, I didn't know you lived here. I'm not here for that. I'm here to ask your vote." But it was awkward. But he said, you could tell by his face and his reaction, "Oh my God, he's coming here for his client's money." But long story short, had the vote. And I can't remember the actual outcome, but within either state law or city law, the Mr. Dutrumbull won. But it was only by 17 votes, 21. It was a narrow enough margin that by law, the ballots had to be recounted, and they took all the ballots to the police station. And at the time, Luc Anger, who was the city clerk, oversaw the process. All the ballots were counted, and it changed by a couple of 3 votes, but not enough to change the outcome. And I was very impressed by how professional everyone was. But that was, I lost. But later, when Bob Farley got elected mayor, on the first year he ran, I ran on a ticket because we had tickets back then. We don't have that anymore because we still had partisan elections for city elections under the old city charter, and the mayor was the chief executive officer of city government. Today we have a professional city manager. But when Bob Farley ran, I was on Willie Bryant's slate, not Bob Farley's. And I was bested by the person who was running think it was Ward 5, Ward 6, but in any event, a young man who was working with Bob Farley won. But I apparently caught Bob Farley's eye, and I think his future city solicitor, Eddie Caron's eye, and now Mayor Farley put me on the planning board, which gave me some exposure. I also enjoyed the work, with some good people on the planning board, and the planner at the time was John Roberts, who has since passed away. But I liked working with John a lot. But it gave me some exposure, and so in 1986, 87, I decided to run for mayor. And much to my surprise, I won.
Now, what was there anything in particular that really prompted you to run for mayor?
Again, it was not a childhood desire that I was trying to fulfill. One thing, and it's part of why I want to come back to Maine in our earlier conversation, I think I learned this from my parents, although they never held public office, but they were always engaged with their parish, with the school, with St. Andre's Home. So I remember my mother going door to door, campaigning for the American Heart Fund and the American Cancer Fund. So that kind of volunteerism was something I saw my parents do, and for reasons I can't explain other than being of the next generation, was it a John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, civil rights influence that had me look to public service. But public service always attracted me, and growing up in the 60s, 70s, politics still had a good reputation. We were hopeful that we could change the world. So I was attracted to public service, I think, for those reasons, and that perhaps you could make a difference if you held office, whether appointed or elected.
Now, do you recall when you did become the mayor, like what are some of the issues that you encountered?
I think the most controversial issue is that under the Bob Farley administration and that council, they had come under great pressure from the Maine and federal Department of Environmental Protection to shut down our landfill. We had shut down the landfill at what is now and has been for decades Rotary Park. We had moved to Andrews Road, but it no longer met current standards, and we were told that we had to do something about it or face some very harsh sanctions, financial sanctions. So the city embarked in problem and solution finding effort, and they arrived at a waste to treatment, a waste to energy plant, and that brought us MRC. And so when I stepped into office, not only was there a plan to shut down the Andrews Road landfill, but we had entered into a contract with the predecessors of MRC. I can't remember their name now, but people, and I think it's fair to say the city could have done more homework on what that meant, but the city was told, you got to make a decision, you got to make this better, or else we're going to fine you multi-million dollars. MRC was a contract that was on my desk that was a city obligation. And for reasons that just seem so obvious today, there were people that were unhappy about that. And the plant did not work the way it was expected to work. You might recall the ash being spewed and the odor and the traffic. It was not good. The other pressing issue the city was facing also at the time, also with DEP pressure was overboard discharge of untreated waste at Biddeford Pool, Fortunes Rock, and Hills Beach. All those homes, all those cottages had pipes from the bathroom right into the water, untreated. And appropriately so, DEP said, you can't do that anymore. These are fishing waters, these are recreational waters, you can't do that anymore. So the city was also undertaking a huge effort to reroute the pipes from these homes, these cottages, into a main pipe that would feed into a waste treatment plant. So we had to negotiate land for a waste treatment plant. We had to dig up all those neighborhoods, had to get permission to work with residents or owners, many of whom at the time did not live year-round. So it was chasing people who lived in Ohio, in New Jersey, and Connecticut. And DEP didn't really care too much that the people who lived in Ohio might winter in Arizona, and getting a hold of them was tough. He said, you've got to clean the water. So that was a challenge. We didn't, under my term, we didn't solve the MERC problem. That took much longer, and frankly, Alan Casavant and his council deserve. They finally accomplished what people had hoped for years: have them move out, buy out the land, and reinvest in downtown Biddeford. But I believe my administration, council, city staff, and myself were instrumental in getting the waters off our Atlantic shore at Biddeford Pool, Mile Stretch Road, Fortunes Rock, by improving that situation by stopping overboard discharge and treating the wastewater, so that if you catch lobster, if you catch fish, or if you go swimming, you're swimming in clean water. And the other issue that had been controversial while I was mayor, that we managed to make some progress, was the Central Firehouse. I think many people of a certain age remember the Central Firehouse on Washington Street in Biddeford, especially the decorations at Christmas. You know, my parents always took us to go see it, and it was always a moment of ooh and ah. It was our local equivalent of the Boothbay Botanical Gardens at Christmas time. But it was literally falling apart. The old Central Fire Station had bricks that were popping out and falling on the sidewalk and driveway of the old firehouse. And there had been discussion and fights, political fights, disagreement over, do we put it at 5 points? Do we put it here? Do we put it there? Do we buy land? And I weighed in, and at the time, the mayor was a strong CEO office, and said, don't we own land downtown? The answer is yes, we own what had been Public Works, which had moved to Hills Beach, next to Portland Glass, off Alfred, abutting Mr. Carrier's property. I said, why don't we build it there? Okay. And the idea apparently sounded reasonable. We didn't have to buy the land. The land was big enough to build a decent Central Firehouse. And that was, I didn't get to cut the ribbon for the new firehouse, but we were able to start that progress. Another thing we started, a couple of things too, was my administration saw the ending of something that started before, so I can't claim any credit other than we were able to finish the project. We added on to what was then the middle school on Hill Street. We needed to build further, and we did that. And we needed a new elementary school, and the plans were approved. We purchased land, and plans were approved for the elementary school. So we got that going, and finally, through urban renewal and through the great efforts of the city council and Bob Dodge, who was economic development director for many, many years in Biddeford, we were able to tear down the tenements on the corner of Water Hill and Maine as you take the bridge into Saco and York Hill, and create what eventually became Mechanics Park. But that tearing down and that dreaming of that as parkland started during my administration.
And now, if I understand this correctly, the mayor's job was not really a full-time job. You were still working. I mean, your livelihood was still being an attorney. How'd you handle all that?
Well, it certainly helped that I was younger. Certainly helped that I enjoyed good health. Certainly helped that there were some very good and competent and experienced department heads and city employees, frankly. It was and sometimes still is popular to bash government employees, but they worked hard. They lived in the city or had been brought up in the city, and they cared. And the city council cared.
How did you juggle?
Well,
How did you handle your job?
It meant working very often 50, 60 hours a week. Between office hours and meetings for City Hall, for the mayor's job, and addressing my clients' needs and interest in being in court. It was easily a 50-hour a week and sometimes more, combining the two work. But at the time it was stimulating, it was interesting, and I was younger.
Now, is there anything that comes to mind in terms of you have the perspective of having been a mayor, and I'm wondering if people have a perception of what it's like to be a mayor. Is there anything that you would want to offer about here's something people may not realize about what it's really like to be a mayor?
Well, the office of mayor today is different from when I served as mayor, although I think there are still residual impressions and expectations, even if the current city charter makes it impossible to meet those expectations. And by that I mean, when I served as mayor, the charter vested into the mayor full authority to run the city. I mean, you had to work with the council and you couldn't break the law, but it was a powerful executive position. It's much less so today. The day-to-day operation of city are vested in the city manager, insulating those decisions from political influences, but still maintaining a level of transparency and accountability, because to whom does the city manager answer? The city council and the mayor. I think what people maybe need to understand, and I believe some people do, but mayor is not all powerful. Mayor does need to work with a council, and you always have to be careful and mindful that most of what you do, you're doing with other people's money, and people work hard for their money. At times, I think in Biddeford we've been a little too timid in moving forward with projects that had a price tag, because sometimes the longer you wait, the more expensive it gets, because whatever you're trying to address, if it's a problem, it gets worse. If I spring a leak in the ceiling today, if I wait 3 days to fix it, that's fine. But if I wait 3 years, maybe it's going to get a lot worse. but it's the no. In Biddeford's history, people like Papalozio perhaps had a reputation, perhaps even indeed had the authority to fire, hire, and be the boss. Um, that hasn't been the case, certainly under the new charter, uh, and and I don't think it was that was people's full expectation even when I served, because I think people people were getting used to having a more direct say in things as opposed to just one person.
So you decided to do just one term as a mayor?
I did, and I gotta say, being mayor was a great job. I loved it, but the end of my first and only term coincided with uh, an upcoming race on the county level for district attorney. As an adult, as a lawyer, I had always wanted to be district attorney, not as a childhood dream, but as a professional, as a lawyer, because after 4 years in private practice in Biddeford, I worked a couple of years as an assistant DA, having been recruited by then DA Gene Libby, and I loved that. So when the election came up, and the who would have been the outgoing DA, Mary Tousignan from Old Orchard, first woman DA in York County. When Mary decided she wasn't going to run again, and that the seat was open, I wanted to run for it, and it would have been incompatible to serve as DA had I been elected, and mayor. So I crossed my fingers that I'd win the DA's office race, and decided not to run again for mayor. I had some misgivings about that. It was because I did like being mayor, and one of the nice things about municipal government, not always, is that you can see almost in real time, not always, how policy and new policies and changes to policy affect people. I mean, sometimes it takes 2 years, 4 years, 10 years for you to see that. But on the state level, sometimes it takes 5 and 20 years before you see change. And you see it more quickly. And you also get feedback. You know, you're in aisle 7 of Hannaford's and someone comes up to you and says, I like what the city did on Myrtle Street, or I don't like what the city did on Myrtle Street. The reaction and the effect are much more immediate, and that can be satisfying. But knowing that the DA's office DA's race was an open race, I decided not to run again.
So to someone who's not in that line of work, why help us understand what is appealing about being a district attorney.
Again, you get to shape public policy. Not that you make up the laws. The laws are made by the legislature and signed into law by any governor. But you get to pick and choose, and you make decisions that can have a profound effect on the accused, as well as on any victim. And you get to participate in a branch of government. DAs, prosecutors in the executive branch of government, but you're working within that other branch of government, the judicial branch, and you're helping to maintain that democratic institution by, hopefully, and you have an obligation, by being fair and honest. The first job of a prosecutor, of a DA, is not to win a case, but it's to do justice. And that calls for the exercise of judgment, that calls for the exercise of fairness, and that calls, in my view, the understanding that people make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are terrible mistakes, but that needn't necessarily define their whole life. So the ability to effectuate change on an individual basis and to shape public policy really attracted me. And honestly, the competitive nature of trial work, because you're guaranteed to do more trials uh, either as a prosecutor or a criminal defense lawyer, which I had also done, than in any other branch of law.
Now, I prefaced this before we started this interview, not looking to divulge anything that's not in the public sphere, but are there any cases in particular that, will be with you, that are still with you, that really made an impression?
Oh, yes. Um,
Or a genre, a type of case that...
um, in one of the I learned about domestic violence and its effect on the job as a prosecuting attorney. And as I learned more about that and how widespread it is, it was a real eye-opener to me that this had been going on forever, and in the 1980s and onward was all for me, and I think for a lot of Maine, but for me, I was only now beginning to learn about it and hearing about it. There were many terrible cases of domestic violence in various forms that I came across as a prosecutor, but one that stands out in my mind, among many, was the case where husband, wife having a fight. The husband, in this case, had a history of hurting the wife. They had verbal fights, but also physical fights. And one fight, it really blew up, and the husband had a gun. And they were fighting. The wife slash mother, because there was a child, was kind of pushed into the bedroom where the closets in the wall were and the bed. So the space that she's in is not that big. And so she's kind of cornered. And husband was threatening her with the gun. And because I don't believe he was the biological father, the son got between his mom and the guy with the gun and got hurt. And survived, but that a child should have been that close and have been hit by a bullet shook me. That things can get to that point. Of course, there's another case that, remember, and this coincided with my father having had a stroke, and at the time was undergoing rehabilitation at the old Brighton Hospital in Portland. And it wasn't my case, but I was in the DA's office. And the case involved allegations of stealing a cat. Two neighbors who did not get along in a very nice neighborhood. One had a cat that had disappeared, and the owner thought they could see it at the neighbor's house. Neighbor denied having it, and at some point the cat decided to go back home, and the owner saw it. Anyhow, a charge of theft was brought, and that went before the jury. And I think eventually the jury might have decided cats are cats and they'll go where they darn well please. But I remember my father, who could not speak, was just gibberish. But telling that story to my dad, who's in bed, and my sister, and just hearing him laugh that, so this is what you do for a living, son? And there was another case where uh, and I tried the case and lost it, charging an elderly gentleman with assault. This was at a senior citizen living complex, and everyone was lined up for a meal, and there was a woman, a man, and a man, and both men, well in their 70s, maybe older, um, were had a affection for this woman, and they were talking, and at some point one of the men got upset that you're talking to my girl, and pushed him, and he fell. He didn't get hurt, but it met all the elements of an assault, and tried that case, and the jury came back with a not guilty verdict, and someone who was observing the case says, yeah, problem was, Mike, that was a cocoon. Remember that was a cocoon case. It's just no one wants to send this grandfatherly looking guy to jail. It just they were actually kind of amused that they were competing over a love interest. So yeah, but you should push people down. I know, but no harm, no foul.
So then you moved on from quite an array of cases here to you ended up having a state role.
Yes, I was asked by newly elected Governor John Baldacci, who I had only met incidentally in political events, like the Democratic Convention. Did not really know him. He was Bangor based. I was from Biddeford, but was invited to apply for a position in his cabinet as Commissioner of Public Safety. I did. I got interviewed by a search committee. I got interviewed by Governor Baldacci and was offered the job. And resigned as being DA and got sworn in as Commissioner of Public Safety and served for 4 years. You may recall, though, that shortly after taking office, Governor Baldacci, the state's budget was running in the red. We didn't have enough money to pay for what was in the current budget. And the economy was slowing down. Before I even got confirmed by the legislature as commissioner, never mind sworn in, I was asked to attend a meeting at the Criminal Justice Academy in Vassalboro, Maine, to meet with a group of 50, 70 public safety personnel who were at risk of being laid off, of being fired, because they just didn't have enough money. And it was a cold January day, traveled up to Vassalboro, wind was whipping across the road, that bright blue sky in the winter, fresh snow everywhere. And people that, I knew a few of those people through my DA work, but just about the entire liquor enforcement agent were being phased out under the budget that was going to be proposed, and I had no authority, but no one else was available to talk to them, and it was an important and difficult lesson about how government decisions, even when necessary, because you can't print money, you can't invent money. And by state constitution, you have to have a balanced budget. That decisions affect human beings, their families, and their livelihood. And it was sort of a baptism of fire.
Can you think of a highlight during that?
As commissioner?
Yeah.
Yes. Governor Baldacci asked me to head up a statewide task force on domestic violence. So on a at least monthly basis for several months, had stakeholders from Caribou all the way down to Berwick, all the way from Sugarloaf to Booth Bay, people who talked about what needed to be done, how to work on prevention, how to hold people who committed domestic violence accountable. And out of that grew an initiative, really thanks to the motivation and dedication of Family Crisis, which was the Cumberland County agency to help victims of domestic violence offer emergency shelter, and got a grant that enabled us to produce video lessons for the entire state employee personnel throughout the state, and you could access it through a computer. It was sort of online training, if you will, on how to recognize domestic violence and what to do if you see it, and how to report it, maintaining your anonymity if you feel you need to, and that electronic training through a computer, per Governor Baldacci's order, was universal. Everyone. So we had thousands of people, certainly hundreds of people, who got their first exposure to what domestic violence is, how it can be terrible, and what to do about it in a supportive and helpful way. And so that reached a lot of people, and I was proud of that.
And then there was a transition from that into the position you ultimately had before you retired.
Yes. Governor Baldacci in 2007 nominated me to be a district court judge. There were some openings on the bench, and he nominated me, and I was happy and humbled that he did. That process involved being interviewed by a selection committee, and they recommended me to Governor Baldacci, and then confirmation hearing in the Joint Select Committee for the Judiciary, which consists of state senators and state representatives from the House, went through a public hearing on that. They endorsed the nomination. That moved it to the state Senate, and the state Senate endorsed the nomination. So I was named to a 7-year term, first by Governor Baldacci. At the end of those 7 terms, there had been a change in administration, which then Governor Paul LePage. Governor Paul LePage renominated me for a 2nd term, and I was happy for that. Again, the process of being before the Judiciary Committee and then before the Senate, I was confirmed, and of that second 7 term, I served 5 years before deciding to retire.
Did you find that, what was that transition like from being an attorney to a DA to a judge?
DA to attorney, I found easy. Yes, you're wearing a different hat, but you're still an advocate. If you're a criminal defense lawyer, say, you're advocating for a client. Hey, state, prove your case. My guy's presumed innocent under the law. You've got to prove him. And if we all agree that there's enough evidence, then the next step is to negotiate the best deal you can for your client. If you're defending, and if you're the state, you don't always get ironclad cases, believe me. And so negotiating is also a skill set. But they're two sides of the same coin. I found that the transition to being a judge was not only different, but more demanding. Because a judge is a neutral. If you're defending someone, or if you're prosecuting someone, or in a civil suit, you're representing a party, you're advocating for, you're working for a good outcome for your client's side. Judge has no such interest. A judge only interests to make sure everyone was heard, that the law was followed, and that the facts support whatever decision the judge finds as credible according to the elements found in the law. So that meant being an active listener and just paying equal good attention to both sides. Um, and unlike a criminal defense lawyer or a private lawyer for a private concern or a prosecutor, um, I had, as a judge, the judge is responsible for both sides. Uh, Not by way of outcome, but certainly by way of process. Um, and I confess not having a sufficient appreciation for how difficult a judge's job can be, because not everyone goes to court with a lawyer, and that means that people in court, they may have a very good case, they may have a compelling case, they may have serious problems, but they're not used to talking in public. They're not used to telling their story in public. They're not trained in distilling or synthesizing what are the important things about my story that I need to convey to this judge in the 30 minutes I've been given. Not training people have. But yet a judge is supposed to make sense of and understand what the story is by people who aren't accustomed to telling the story. And they've told stories maybe for years and years at the kitchen table. That's not how you present evidence sometimes. And, well, my wife told me, I'm sorry, that's hearsay. And so it, and I hadn't really understood how difficult and how time consuming a judge's work was, because for me a lot of the judge's work was I see him or her in the courtroom, the court officer bellows please rise, everyone gets up and they sit down, everyone has their turn at making their case before the judge. Judge sometimes might decide from the bench, but often gets up, leaves, and I'll send you my decision when I've thought some more about it. The work of thinking some more about it and writing it out, so much of my work had been in the criminal defense or criminal prosecution. We don't do that much writing. And there's a lot of writing at being a judge. Why in a divorce, why am I telling you to sell the house? Or why am I saying you keep the house but you keep the lakeside cottage? Or why am I saying you're going to be the primary care parent but you're going to see the kids at every school vacation every other week? Why am I doing it? I have to explain. And putting that in writing was a challenge. And I'm grateful that I was a judge in southern Maine, because sometimes resources for people were hard to find, but they were easier to find in southern Maine than they might be in central Maine, western Maine, northern Maine, whether it's counseling, experts. But having people trying to explain why they're there required a lot of effort.
And I bet in your years, like a lot of other professions, you've seen a lot of changes take place in the justice system.
Yes. Yes. I mean, certainly it more... we're moving information around more quickly through computers. I mean, when I started as a lawyer, no one had computers. A big deal was is it Olivetti? Memory typewriter. So it kind of had forms programmed in, but it wasn't computer. When I first started practicing law, and even if you wanted to, if the police department in Kennebunk wanted to get a report to the DA's office in Alfred, Someone had to, you either popped it in the mail or someone got it in a cruiser and brought it over. Shortly thereafter, there was this big jump in technology, fax machines. Um, and after fax machines came basic laptop, not laptop, but desktop computers, looked like the small TVs that you probably had in the kitchen growing up. Um, but I personally did not work with a computer until I got to the Commissioner of Public Safety office. Because as DA, the DAs and assistant DAs are paid by the state through the Attorney General's office, but the office, secretaries, paralegals, support staff, and paper, lights, heat, files, that's paid by the county. When I left the DA's office, there might have been 3 or 4 secretaries or office administrators who had computers. I didn't have a computer. So I never learned it. When I first started in the DA's office on how things have changed, we had to submit an annual budget to the county commissioners as well, and through the AG's office, through to the legislature. But the AG's office took care of a lot of that. But for the county commissioners, it was the DA's job. I remember we had big library tables in a room, and we rolled out with my secretary, office administrator, we'd roll out butcher paper, that brown paper, and we'd have magic markers. And we would make a grid on the butcher paper and label each square, so-and-so, not name, but, Superior Court Secretary salary, photocopying costs, toner, things like that, paper for printing, just whatever it took to run an office in 4 sites: Alfred, York, Kittery, Sanford, Springvale, and Biddeford, and we did that by hand, and so we had these long pieces of brown paper. And then my secretary would, with her typewriter that had some electronic features, would convert that into a document. But it was all manually done. It took forever. And then we'd photocopy it and get it to the county commissioner's office.
And in terms of changes, what have you seen in terms of changes of the types of cases, or is...
Well, a constant... And we tend to forget that periodically in terms of problems, something that gets into people's way and creates problems, often, sometimes nasty problems, is alcohol. And I'm leading up to something else, but whether it's OUI or drinking, addiction to alcohol, and how that can affect people's ability to work, or alter their judgment. They say and do things that they may not do if they were sober. Alcohol has always been a problem. That hasn't changed. And I say that because we certainly have heard enough, and it's ongoing, the problems with drugs. Fentanyl, heroin, other drugs. And that has been and remained not only a multi-million-dollar illegal activity, but is also killing people in Maine and ruining their lives, whether it means not getting to a point where they're no longer able to work and the employer doesn't really need them. They burn bridges with family and friends because they borrow money and the friend or family feels, I can't do this anymore. And one case, not far from here, where police come, 2 little kids, 4 and 3, 5 and 4, on the sidewalk, and the police ask these 2 kids, where do you come from? They point to a door. Why are you here? We're hungry. Well, where's mom and dad? they're gone, they've been gone, and the kids let them into the apartment, and the place is not clean. But come to find out, mom and dad were addicted to drugs, had left, and these two little kids were alone. Fortunately, they were still safe, but they were hungry, they were dirty. What it does to people's ability to take care of children, and that's hard work, it can be terrible. Another thing that's changed is people's expectation. I think there's a greater acceptance of treatment before jail, but we're still looking at jail, and but it's I think it's a hopeful sign when police departments start referring people to rehab centers as opposed to throwing them in the county jail.
And then going into a slightly different mode here, I'm aware that you have won more than one award in your life and in your career. Is there one or two in particular that really stand out as being especially meaningful for you?
I think they are, I mean, all are really wonderful and touch me deeply. But three that come to mind are professionally, as a lawyer, I was the recipient of the Walter Smith Award from the York County Bar Association. Walter Smith was a lawyer at Smith Elliott for years, and he's still alive, but he's retired. Was known as the dean of the bar in York County, and because he was always a gentleman, always prepared, good lawyer, got good results. Doesn't mean he always won, but he always did well for his client, and served as a mentor to many lawyers, including myself. I saw you do this, you did that well, but perhaps you could have thought of this, and not in a condescending or hurtful way. It was just like, this is important. We're doing important work. I'm happy to share with you what I know if you want. And so that award, which has been given to other people, of course, meant a lot to me because I so respect Walter Smith. The other award was, and I put it on the coffee table, was being nominated to the Franco-American Hall of Fame here in Maine by the legislature. And that meant a lot to me because, as this conversation might suggest, I self-identify as a Franco-American. I'm very proud of that, and it was an honor and a privilege to receive that public recognition for my, at least personal, championing of Franco-American culture and existence through the legislature, and I also received an award years ago for my work in elder abuse prevention, and that meant a lot to me. But that's not to downplay any other award, but those come to mind.
I'll take responsibility for limiting you to 2 or 3. So you've seen a lot of changes in Biddeford. Your thoughts on that evolution and where we are?
Well, first of all, I'm thrilled with the change that Biddeford has seen over the 10 years or so. I'm very happy that people beyond the people such as myself who were born and brought up here have seen Biddeford as a good place to live, a good place to either bring their businesses or to find work. I'm very happy that the population not only has grown, but has grown younger. When I look at myself in the mirror, I might resent that, but It's nice that the median age is 36, 38. Um, uh, and it's also nice, I believe, that the influx of newcomers to Biddeford, not only longtime Mainers, but as well as recent immigrants from Africa, the Mideast, South America, Asia, the Pacific Rim. Uh, these newcomers, whether they originally come from Bridgeton, Maine, or Machias, or Senegal, I think they see Biddeford in ways that perhaps some of us who grew up here didn't see. That we might look at a building and say, "Oh, I remember when that was Butler's department store." They see, isn't that an interesting mid-century building? And wouldn't a store selling waffles do well there? Or, I think their mind is more open. I'm conscious and thankful and grateful to the history that Biddeford has, and happy that there are organizations such as the Biddeford Cultural and Heritage Center and Biddeford Historical Society and others who are preserving that history and communicating it to others who may be interested. But I also like the fact that there's new energy and new sets of eyes to see things and see the potential that perhaps more seasoned Biddeford residents might not have had.
Although I could think of a million other things I'd love to ask you, I'm conscious of time, and I usually like to wrap these up by asking, what is it that you would like people to take away from hearing your story?
I would hope that people would understand how important it is to celebrate Maine's diversity. I came to that perspective as a Franco-American, aware of language, culture, history that takes me and my family and most of my friends to Quebec, and from Quebec to France. But as my father often remarked, Biddeford has always been a city of diversity. Greek Americans, Irish Americans, Polish Americans, Italian Americans. We had a Jewish community here. We had diversity through religious affiliations: Baptist, Congregational, Episcopalian, Catholic, Greek Orthodox. And the history of our mills certainly are an economic and cultural lesson in diversity. We had people from Turkey. We had people from all over the world work in those mills, earn money, put down roots here, and eventually stayed or moved away. And commercially, economically, those mills had great relationships, profitable relationships with China, Japan, Europe, South America. So the Biddeford as a city with a proud history is important, but that history also contains, and as it does today, branches into the whole world, and with people bringing new ideas and new experiences that have made Biddeford thrive and dynamic.
Well, thank you so much.